A central concept within intercultural competence is that of privilege, which refers to the unearned advantages that somebody has just through their social status. And oftentimes, this is tied to the advantages someone gets through their race, gender, sexuality, or ability. For example, decades of research tells us that in the United States, it's very difficult to transcend the class status that one is born into. While it is certainly possible for somebody who was born into poverty to become wealthy one day, this is most often the exception rather than the norm. In fact, one recent study has shown that only 1 in 5 American men surpass the economic status of their fathers. Likewise, being born into a wealthy family greatly reduces a person's chance of living a life of poverty when they come of age. This is because having that sort of class advantage, access to resources, gives person many advantages, such as better access to health care, better access to education, schools that are highly funded. And this is privilege as it relates to one's class or socioeconomic status, but race is another important factor when it comes to privilege as well. In 1988, renowned scholar Peggy McIntosh published an essay that would have a uniquely widespread impact on how people think and talk about race and privilege. Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack of White Privilege, as her famous essay is titled, provides a list of ways that she feels that white privilege has impacted her life. So it's sort of a reflection on the advantages that she's gained through her own white privilege as a white woman. And the invisible knapsack part of this is her way of visualizing for us the privilege that we all carry around with us, which is often going unseen, even though it has a real world impact. So she's saying we need to go through our knapsack and see what's in there and make those things more visible. I invite you to read and reflect upon her entire list, but here I'd like to highlight and discuss a few of them in particular. Doing so helps us not only to understand our own position in the world, but also allows us to practice some empathy for other people as well. So being interculturally competent, this is something that, the way that you kind of interpret your surroundings, your associations with different people, just empathizing with other people. It's like practicing that as a skill, as you would in exercise or sports or something like that. The more that you practice something, the more you sort of get used to it. And so by doing this kind of interpretive analysis and reflecting on these different points, doing that helps us to, in the moment, be able to react and with empathy and with compassion for other people, and really just understanding where some of these different dynamics come from. So number 1 on the list, McIntosh writes, I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. You may partially understand the significance of this if you've ever traveled to another country where you are not fluent in the primary language that's being spoken there in that region. It can be an exhausting experience constantly having to translate words and phrases that have to do every time you want to have a conversation or find where a bathroom is. After a while, you just sort of get dragged down, right? And you're maybe, at least I have this experience, I'm not feeling like being as social because every social interaction that I have is extremely draining, because it's a big intellectual drain to have to do that translation mentally. And then, social dynamics make it also kind of emotionally and physically draining as well to go through that. And that's like a little snippet of, imagine being in that situation all the time. So here in the United States, people who live here are experiencing that all the time in places where they work, in places where they go to school, etc. So this can be a real advantage, or really like a disadvantage, if you're constantly feeling drained because you're just not around people who sort of understand who you are, don't make you sort of justify yourself, or people that you have that automatic sort of connection with, who are coming from your own race or your own culture. The third item on the list reads, I can be pretty sure that my neighbors in such a location will be neutral or pleasant to me. When choosing where you're going to live, can you imagine having to factor in whether or not you're going to be accepted by your neighbors simply because of your culture or because of how you look for racial reasons? Can you imagine doing this when you're choosing which restaurant you want to eat in on a given night, which retail stores you want to shop at? This is a reality for many people of color. And it sort of fits in with the first aspect. It's like all of these things sort of compiled really start to weigh on a person. And those are all the kinds of decisions that if you're not impacted by that, if you've never had to really think about that very often, that's a real advantage, because it's not, that's not bettering anybody's life having to think about that. If anything, it's more draining, and it's keeping you out of certain neighborhoods. It's keeping you out of particular places where you don't feel safe or where you don't feel welcomed. Number 7 on the list reads, I can be sure that my children will be given curricular materials that testify to the existence of their race. This is a point that I often share with students in my classes, and I sometimes share a personal story with them coming from a Mexican-American family myself and growing up in Michigan. It wasn't until much later in my life that I fully realized the lack of education that I received around Mexican, or at least Mexican-American culture, as though it had nothing to do with American history, as though, we were not one of the largest minority groups living in the country. And so I don't remember being assigned Mexican, let alone a Latino author, until college or maybe even grad school. And people of many other races and ethnicities have similar stories that they've shared with me as well. When I have students in my class, oftentimes Mexican or Latino students will come up to me and tell me that I'm the first Latino teacher that they've ever had, and I'm teaching college level. So this is not a unique experience. Oftentimes when non-Western histories or cultures are taught in education, they're taught as electives, so not as the main history, but as these sort of histories that you can pick and choose from. They're not the primary history of the United States, but there's these other sort of fringe or marginalized histories from communities of color that you could study if you have extra time, or you want to put in the extra work, or you want to use your electives doing that, right? So that's another sort of disadvantage that people of color often face. Number 15 reads, I am never asked to speak for all the people of my racial group. So number 7 and 15 go together a little bit here, because, and all of them really, because if there's not that many people from your race or culture in a workplace or in a classroom or a space like that, oftentimes there's this sort of pressure that gets put on those few people of color who are in the room, that they're then the representatives of that race. And so if they make any kind of mistake, or they don't have pleasant interactions with everybody, then people are going to sort of use that, or just internally have a bias against that race, because those people are seen as, especially for people who don't interact with other races very often, that just sort of becomes implanted as a sort of stereotype sometimes in people's minds. So it's an added pressure that people of color have when they're not in diverse spaces. And additionally, number 22 states, I can take a job with an affirmative action employer without having coworkers on the job suspect that I got it because of race. And this is also true for, it doesn't necessarily have to be an affirmative action hire. This is how she wrote it, but I think it's true in general. When there's so few people of color in positions of power, we could look at political positions of power. It's certainly true in higher education where I work, that the higher up you go, the less and less people of color there are. And so then when you do get into those positions, sometimes we're questioned about whether or not we actually deserved it, or did we just get that position because we were seen as a diverse hire, right? And so it's something that people are fully aware of. It plays into the imposter syndrome then, people questioning their own worth and being questioned by their colleagues. So it leads to a very unhealthy cycle. Number 26 reads, I can choose blemish cover over Band-Aids in flesh color and have them more or less match my skin. I think this is a good example of a microaggression, which is a statement, action, or incident regarded as an instance of indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group, such as a racial or ethnic minority. And the companies who make these kinds of products may not have intended, they probably didn't intend to exclude people with darker skin, but the assumption that flesh has one particular color still has that impact of exclusion. So whether or not it was intended, that's still the sort of consequence of it. And taken on their own, microaggressions might not seem like a big deal. But if you can imagine constantly having to face all of the items on this list that just are consistently interrupting your day-to-day flow because of the color of your skin, after a while it becomes truly exhausting. And so these seemingly micro instances of discrimination can have a serious impact on how people view themselves. Importantly, it needs to be understood that what gives microaggressions power like this is the fact that they are tied to more widespread structural forms of discrimination in society. So in this sense, the U.S. is not just, it's not unjust because these microaggressions exist. If this Band-Aid example existed in a vacuum, maybe it wouldn't be a very big deal, but microaggressions are indications of the unfair treatment marginalized communities experience in a broader sense. So it's more what they're connected to rather than just the microaggression on their own. All of the items on McIntosh's list are things that may be difficult to see if you are not negatively impacted by them yourself. This is why she writes that to redesign social systems, we need to first acknowledge their colossal unseen dimensions. And she continues, the silence and denials surrounding privilege are the key political tool here. They keep the thinking about equality or equity incomplete, protecting unearned advantage and conferred dominance by making these taboo subjects. Most talk by whites about equal opportunity seems to me now to be about equal opportunity to try to get into a position of dominance while denying that systems of dominance exist, end quote. So this kind of awareness is really an early step toward becoming interculturally competent, part of a much larger and ongoing commitment to learning and acting with compassion for one another. So it's about being knowledgeable about these subjects and being able to reflect on them, to understand our own position in relation to them.